A senior vice president at an association sat across from me during a transformation engagement, and she said something that I've never forgotten. She said, "Kevin, we have spent 18 months designing the perfect transformation strategy. We hired the best consultants. We built the most comprehensive communication plan that I've ever seen, and it all died in the middle." I asked her what she meant by that, and she said, "It died with our directors and our senior managers, the people who we were counting on to make it all real. They smiled in every leadership meeting. They nodded at every town hall. And then they went back to their teams and either did nothing or quietly undermined everything that we had built. We blamed them for being resistant." She then shared that it took her a year to realize that they were set up to fail from the very beginning. That conversation captures something most organizations refuse to see. Middle managers are simultaneously the most critical and the most neglected human element in change and transformation. They are asked to carry the weight of change without being given the psychological support, the authority, or the honest acknowledgement of what that weight actually cost them. I'm Kevin Novak, CEO of 2040 Digital, professor at the University of Maryland, and author of the book, The Truth About Transformation, Leading in the Age of AI, Uncertainty, and Human Complexity, along with the Ideas and Innovations weekly newsletter. Welcome to the Human Factor Podcast, the show that explores the intersection of humanity, technology, and transformation, along with the psychology behind transformation success. Today, we're exploring the middle management trap and why organizations systematically set their most important change agents up to fail. In our last episode, Elizabeth Stewart and I explored the contagion effect. We talked about how emotions spread through organizations during change and transformation. We examined the science of emotional contagion, why transformation creates perfect conditions for negative emotional spread. One of the patterns that we discussed was the anxiety cascade, where emotional states travel through organizational layers. Today, we're looking at the organizational layer where the anxiety cascade converges with the greatest force and causes the most damage: the organization's middle management. If you listen to how most organizations talk about middle managers during transformation, you're going to hear language that reveals a fundamental misunderstanding. You'll hear they need to get on board. You'll hear we need their buy-in. You'll hear they're the ones blocking progress. This language labels middle managers as obstacles to be overcome rather than as human beings who are navigating an extraordinarily complex psychological position. And that misunderstanding, that failure to see the human reality of what middle management actually experiences during change, is one of the primary reasons change and transformation efforts fail. The research on this is extensive and clear. Robert Kahn and his colleagues established a framework for understanding role conflict and role ambiguity in organizations back in 1964. What they found, and what decades of subsequent research has confirmed, is that the people occupying boundary-spanning positions, the people caught between competing demands from above and below, experience the highest levels of psychological strain. Middle managers occupy the most intense boundary-spanning positions in any organization. And during change and transformation, that position becomes exponentially more anxiety-filled. Today, I'm going to walk through why middle managers carry a disproportionate psychological burden during change. The 5 distinct psychological burdens that converge on middle management during transformation, and what senior leaders can actually do to stop destroying the people they depend on the most to make change come to life. Before we get into the psychology, I want to establish the structural reality of what middle management actually looks like during organizational change and transformation. Because the structural position at its core creates a psychological trap. I've written about this in our transformation psychology series on 2040digital.com. I describe middle management's impossible position. They're expected to simultaneously represent senior leadership's strategic vision to their teams and represent their team's operational realities to senior leadership. During stable periods, this dual representation function works reasonably well. During change and transformation, it can become structurally impossible to navigate. Middle managers occupy what organizational researchers call a linking pin position. This concept traces back to Likert's work in the 1960s, and it describes roles that connect different organizational levels, translating strategic intent downward and operational reality upwards. In stable environments, this linking pin function is manageable. Difficult, yeah, but manageable. During change and transformation, it becomes something entirely different. It becomes a psychological pressure point that most organizations never acknowledge, let alone address. Here's what the structural position actually looks like during change. Senior leadership designs a transformation strategy. They have access to the strategic rationale, the market pressures, the financial modeling, and the future state vision that makes the change very necessary. They've had months, sometimes even years, to process the need for change before announcing it. They've talked through their concerns with boards, consultants, and each other. But by the time transformation is announced, senior leaders have already completed much of their own psychological adjustment. They're processing their identity threats. They've processed their competence concerns, and they have addressed their strategic anxieties in relative privacy. Middle managers then receive the change or transformation mandates with far less context, far less processing time, and far less psychological support. Here, Floyd and Wooldridge demonstrated that middle managers play 4 critical strategy roles. 1, championing alternatives. 2, synthesizing information. 3, facilitating adaptability. And 4, implementing deliberate strategy. During transformation, all 4 of these roles are simultaneously activated and often in conflict with each other. They're supposed to champion the new direction while synthesizing information that may suggest that it's flawed. They're supposed to facilitate acceptance in their teams while implementing a strategy they may not fully understand or even agree with. And here's the structural reality that makes this a trap. Middle managers must simultaneously undergo their own psychological transformation while helping their teams undergo theirs. Julia Balogun's 2003 research in the British Journal of Management identified 4 simultaneous demands on middle managers during change: undertaking personal change, helping others through change, implementing changes in their part of the organization, and keeping the business running. 4 demands operating simultaneously with no one attending to the fact that the first demand, their own personal psychological journey through change, is the foundation on which the other 3 depend. The 2025 study published in the Journal of Applied Behavioral Sciences by Wang and his colleagues examined 242 middle managers and found that role overload is directly and positively related to resistance to change. And that this relationship is mediated by workplace anxiety. In plain language, when you pile more demands on middle managers than they can psychologically sustain, they become anxious. And that anxiety produces the very resistance that organizations then blame them for. The structural trap is this. Organizations give middle managers responsibility for change execution without acknowledging that the structural position itself generates the psychological conditions that undermine execution. And then they wonder why projects and initiatives fail. Let me introduce a framework for understanding the specific psychological burdens that converge on middle management during change and transformation. I call these the 5 burdens because they operate simultaneously and each one amplifies the other. Organizations that understand these burdens can begin to address them. Organizations that don't will continue to burn out the people that they need the most. The first burden is what I call the translation burden. Middle managers are expected to take abstract strategic vision and convert it into concrete operational reality. This isn't a communication task. It's a psychological task. Translation requires that the middle manager first understand the strategic intent well enough to interpret it, then believes in it enough to convey it authentically, and then adapts it to the specific context of their teams in a way that makes the change feel relevant and achievable rather than threatening and imposed. Research on sense making, particularly the work of Balogun and Johnson, shows that middle managers engage in intense lateral sense making during change, working with peers to construct shared understanding of what the change or transformation actually means for their part of the organization. This sense making process is essential for translation, but it is also psychologically exhausting because it requires holding uncertainty while projecting clarity. Every time a middle manager stands in front of their team and explains the transformation, they are performing a psychological act that requires them to appear more certain than they feel, more confident than their information warrants, and more aligned than they may actually be. And as we discussed in our last episode on emotional contagion, any gap between what they project and what they actually feel is detected by their teams. So the translation burden isn't just the cognitive work of converting strategy into operations. It's the emotional labor of maintaining authenticity while navigating their own unresolved doubts. The second burden is the absorption burden. Middle managers serve as an emotional shock absorbers for the organization. They absorb anxiety downward from senior leadership, which we explored in detail in our last episode on emotional contagion. And they absorb frustration, fear, and resistance upward from their teams. They are the organizational layer where these two emotional currents absolutely collide. Quy Nguyen Hui's landmark research demonstrated a 3-year field study that found middle managers perform what he called emotional balancing, simultaneously maintaining emotional commitment to change while attending to the emotional needs of the change recipients. His research showed that when middle managers failed to balance these two emotional demands, the result was either organizational inertia from too little commitment or chaos from too little attention to the recipient's emotions. The middle managers who successfully balanced both did so at enormous personal cost. The absorption burden then is compounded by the fact that middle managers have very few outlets for their own emotional processing. They can't express their anxieties upwards without appearing uncommitted to the transformation. They can't express their frustrations downwards without fueling the very resistance that they're actually trying to manage. And the peer conversations where they process these emotions laterally often become the echo chambers of anxiety we discussed in our last episode. So the absorption burden means middle managers are metabolizing the organization's emotional waste without anyone recognizing that this process has limits. It comes down to the psychological energy required to constantly adapt, learn, and maintain performance while everything familiar to you changes around you. The warning signs here are subtle. Previously reliable employees showing unpredictable performance patterns. Competent people suddenly seeking excessive approval for very routine decisions. Normally curious people becoming reluctant to engage with new development opportunities. These aren't performance problems, they're exhaustion symptoms. The third burden connects directly to what we explored in our season 2 premiere on the identity crisis of expertise. Middle managers often hold their positions precisely because of the expertise and operational knowledge they've accumulated over years or even decades. The identity transition framework I introduced in that episode identifies 5 identity threats that transformation creates. The first, competence threat. The second, relevance threat. The third, status threat. The fourth, narrative threat. And finally, community threat. Middle managers are uniquely vulnerable to all 5 simultaneously. This convergence crisis touches on identity rather than merely skill. Leaders and managers who were most successful in the previous paradigm have the most invested in that paradigm's continuation. Their promotions, their reputation, and their sense of professional self-worth are all derived from excellence and capabilities that transformation may render less valuable. That's not a skills gap that you can close with training. That's an identity crisis. Their competence is questioned when the transformation introduces new systems, new processes, or ways of working that their existing expertise doesn't cover. The relevance is threatened when the strategic direction suggests their domain of knowledge may become less central to the organization's future. Their status is challenged when the transformation flattens hierarchies, redistributes authority, or introduces new roles that didn't exist before. Their narrative, the story that they tell themselves about how their career has progressed and where it's heading, is disrupted by changes they didn't choose and may not have been consulted about. In their community, the network of relationships and shared understanding that they've built with peers and direct reports is fractured by reorganizations, new team structures, and shifting alliances. Harvard Business Review published research in October 2025 revealing that middle managers feel the least psychological safety of any organizational level. Fear of failure, the lack of peer support, and weak modeling from senior leaders are all silencing the very people responsible for transmitting vital information up and down the organization. When we connect this to identity threat, the picture becomes clear. Middle managers are experiencing profound identity disruption while being positioned in the role with the least psychological safety to process that disruption. The fourth burden is the loyalty burden, and it's the one that creates the most internal conflict. Middle managers occupy a position of dual loyalty. They are expected to be loyal to the senior leadership that designed the transformation and loyal to the teams that they lead who are affected by it. In stable times, these loyalties are largely aligned. During transformation, they frequently diverge. This is what Kahn's foundational research identified as role conflict. The experience of receiving clear but incompatible expectations from different organizational sources. When senior leadership says, implement this change on the timeline, and the middle manager's team says This change will damage our ability to deliver. The middle manager then is caught between two legitimate claims on their allegiance. Whichever direction that they lean, they experience the psychological strain of betraying the other. Their natural loyalty pulls them towards protection of the team members. Yet their career prospects and organizational survival often depend on demonstrating alignment with senior leadership priorities. You can't resolve this conflict by forcing middle managers to choose sides. You resolve it by eliminating the forced choice through systematic interventions that acknowledge the psychological impossibility of serving two masters simultaneously. The loyalty burden is further intensified by a dynamic I observe repeatedly in my consulting work. Organizations expect middle managers to be advocates for the change, not just the implementers. They are expected to genuinely believe in and promote the transformation, even when their own assessment might be more nuanced or even skeptical. This expectation to internalize or promote a position that they may have reservations about creates what psychologists call cognitive dissonance, the psychological discomfort of holding contradictory beliefs simultaneously. Over time, this dissonance is either resolved through genuine belief change, which requires time and evidence that organizations rarely provide, or through surface compliance that manifests as the very inauthenticity we discussed in our episode on emotional contagion. The fifth burden is the accountability burden, and it's perhaps the most structurally unfair. Middle managers are held accountable for transformation outcomes they have limited ability to control. They don't design the strategy. They don't set the timeline. They don't allocate the resources. They don't make the technology decisions. But when a transformation initiative fails to achieve its objectives, they are the ones who have to answer for it. This creates what organizational behavioral literature describes as a control accountability gap, where the level of accountability exceeds the level of control. Research consistently shows that this gap is one of the most potent predictors of workplace stress and burnout. A Gallup 2025 Global Workplace Report found that managers account for up to 70% of the variance in team engagement and well-being. That accountability burden is compounded by a timing asymmetry that most organizations never address. Senior leaders often evaluate transformation progress on quarterly or annual timescales, while middle managers are managing the day-to-day reality of resistance, confusion, skill gaps, and emotional fallout. The gap between the timeline on which results are demanded and the timeline on which genuine human adaptation occurs creates a constant state of pressure that middle managers have no mechanism to resolve. Then, when all five burdens converge, which they do in virtually every significant transformation, the psychological load on middle managers exceeds what any reasonable organizational role should demand. Now, I want to address something that often goes unspoken in transformation conversations. It's the role that traditional change management approaches play in perpetuating the middle management trap. Because most of what organizations do to support middle managers during change actually makes the problem much worse. Traditional change management treats middle managers as a delivery mechanism. They're given talking points, communication toolkits, frequently asked question documents, along with training on how to cascade messages to their teams. The underlying assumption here is that if you give middle managers the right information and the right script, they will deliver the message effectively and the change will proceed as planned. Well, this approach fundamentally misunderstands what middle managers actually need. And further, it misunderstands that managers, like any of us, are humans. We are not machines. So the cascade model treats middle managers as message carriers, not as human beings on their own psychological journey through change. Remember, change is external and situational. It's new systems, processes, and organizational structures. Transition is internal and psychological. It's the mental and emotional journey people take to accept and internalize that change. You can mandate change overnight, but transition takes months, years, and it can't be forced. The cascade model manages change. It completely ignores transition. And middle managers are the people for whom that gap between managed change and unmanaged transition creates the most damage because their job is to make meaning, to translate strategic abstraction into operational reality, to help people navigate fear and uncertainty, and to do all of this while managing their own unintended transition. I wrote about this in my book, The Truth About Transformation, when examining the gap between what organizations design and what organizations experience. The design of transformation happens in strategy rooms with strategic minds. The experience of a transformation happens in the daily interactions between middle managers and their teams. When we focus all of our attention on the design and treat the experience as a communication problem, we guarantee failure. Here's what the cascade model actually produces in practice. Senior leadership creates a carefully crafted transformation narrative. They share it with middle managers in a leadership meeting, often with slides, data, and in a confident tone. The middle managers receive this narrative along with all of the emotional content we discussed in our episode on emotional contagion. They're then expected to cascade this message to their teams within days or weeks. But they haven't had time to process their own reactions. They haven't had the opportunity to reconcile the narrative with their own experience and concerns. They haven't been able to identify how the abstract strategic vision connects to the specific operational realities their teams are going to face. So what actually gets cascaded isn't the carefully crafted narrative. It's a filtered, often diluted version of the message, and it's colored by the middle manager's unprocessed emotions, unresolved concerns, and incomplete understanding. And the teams receiving this message don't just hear the words, they read the middle manager's body language, his or her tone, and the level of conviction. As the research in communication science has consistently shown, when verbal and nonverbal messages conflict, people weight the nonverbal signals more heavily because they feel more authentic. The training approach further compounds this problem. Organizations invest in change management training for middle managers that first and foremost focuses on skills. How to communicate change, how to handle resistance, how to facilitate transition. These skills are not irrelevant. I talk about them a lot, but they address the surface while ignoring the foundation. You can't effectively communicate a change you haven't psychologically processed. You can't genuinely handle resistance when you're experiencing your own unacknowledged resistance. You can't facilitate transition for others when no one is helping facilitate your very own transition. The most challenging aspect of the traditional approach is that it positions middle managers as the solution to an organizational problem, while simultaneously being part of that problem. They're told your teams are resisting change. So here are techniques to manage that resistance without any acknowledgement that the middle manager may be experiencing the same identity threats, the same competence concerns, the same emotional reactions as the people that they're supposed to be helping. What middle managers actually need isn't better communication toolkits. They need what every human being needs during a period of significant disruption: time to process their own psychological response, honest acknowledgement of the complexity of their position, genuine involvement in shaping the change rather than just executing it, and psychological safety to express their concerns without being labeled as resistant. And senior leadership, well, they need to understand the emotional reality of what they're asking middle managers to absorb and transmit. So, what does this actually look like in practice? If you're a senior leader who depends on middle managers to execute your change and transformation vision, as every senior leader does, what specifically needs to change? The first shift is from informing to involving. Traditional sequence is design the change, then inform middle managers, then expect execution. My suggestion is that the necessary sequence becomes involve middle managers in the design process so that by the time execution begins, they've already done much of the psychological processing the translation requires. This doesn't mean every middle manager needs to be in every strategy session. It means creating structured mechanisms for middle management input early enough in the process that their operational knowledge shapes the transformation design. And most importantly, their psychological journey begins before they're asked to lead others through it. Floyd and Wooldridge's research demonstrated that middle managers play four strategic roles: championing, synthesizing, facilitating, and implementing. Most organizations only activate the implementing role. When you activate all four, you get better strategy because of the operational intelligence that middle managers contribute. And you get better execution because the middle managers have psychologically invested in a transformation that they help shape rather than one that was imposed upon them. My second suggested shift is from training to processing. Instead of sending middle managers to change management workshops that seek to teach them techniques for handling their team's resistance, create some dedicated space for middle managers to process their own psychological response to the transformation. This might take the form of peer coaching circles where middle managers work through their identity concerns. Also, competence anxieties, handle their role conflicts with colleagues who understand the position because they share it. It might take the form of dedicated sessions with coaches who specialize in transition psychology. It might simply take the form of honest conversations with senior leaders who acknowledge the complexity of the middle management's position and help them create psychological safety for genuine dialogue rather than performance alignment. I want to emphasize that this isn't about being soft or therapeutic. This is about being strategically intelligent. In organizations that sends emotionally unprocessed middle managers in the change execution meetings is making the same mistake as an organization that sends unprepared sales teams in the client negotiations. The preparation here isn't optional. It's foundational. And when that preparation is missing, the results are predictable. The failure rate increases exponentially. The third shift is from accountability to support. This doesn't mean abandoning accountability. It means recognizing that the control accountability gap I described earlier is really a structural problem, not a performance problem. When a middle manager's department isn't adopting the transformation at the expected pace, the first question shouldn't be, why aren't you driving this harder? The first question should be, what barriers are you encountering that we haven't addressed? And what support do you need that you're not getting? Gallup found that managers account for up to 70% of variance in team engagement and well-being. That means when a team isn't engaging with the transformation, the manager's behavior is significant. But that behavior itself, shaped by the five burdens that I described, holding a middle manager accountable for team engagement without addressing the translation burden, the absorption burden, the identity burden, the loyalty burden, and the accountability burden, is like holding a bridge accountable for cracking while continuing to increase the load it carries. The solution isn't a stronger reprimand. It's a structural reinforcement. The fourth shift is from uniformity to differentiation. Traditional change management applies the same approach to all middle managers. The same communication, the same timeline, the same expectations. But not all middle managers are in the same psychological position. Some have been through multiple transformations and carry learned helplessness from previous failures. Some are new to the organization and lack the institutional context to make sense of what's actually happening. Some are managing teams with deep technical expertise and strong identity expertise fusion. Some are managing teams that are more adaptable but less technically deep. The psychological burden varies then based on context, and the support needs to vary accordingly. The fifth shift, and this is one that requires the most courage from senior leadership, is to move from performance to honesty. Senior leaders need to stop asking middle managers to perform alignment that they don't feel. All the research we discussed across episodes of this podcast makes clear that performed confidence is detected as inauthentic and it fuels distrust. So when a middle manager has genuine concerns about the transformation, those concerns need to be heard and engaged with, not managed away through persuasion techniques or framed as resistance. Those who most effectively navigate change were those who balanced emotional commitment to the change with genuine attention to the emotional needs of their people. That balance is impossible when the organizational culture requires performative alignment. It's only possible when senior leaders create conditions where middle managers can be honest about their concerns, honest about their doubts, and honest about the challenges they're seeing on the ground without that honesty being interpreted as a lack of commitment. Let me bring this back to where we started. That senior vice president told me the transformation died in the middle. What she was actually describing, without having the language for it at the time, was the cumulative effect of 5 psychological burdens converging on a group of people who had no organizational support for managing those burdens. The translation burden broke down because no one had helped middle managers process the strategic intent deeply enough to convey it authentically. The absorption burden overwhelmed them because no one was attending to their emotional experience. The identity burden paralyzed them because no one acknowledged that their sense of professional self was even under threat. The loyalty burden fractured their commitment because they were forced to choose between organizational allegiance and team allegiance. And the accountability burden demoralized them because they were held responsible for outcomes that they couldn't control. This isn't a middle management failure. This is a senior leadership failure. And it's a failure that keeps happening repeatedly because organizations continue to design their transformations, treating middle managers as message carriers rather than as the complex human beings who determine whether strategic intent becomes operational reality. In our next episode, we're going to explore something that amplifies every dynamic that we've discussed this season: the algorithmic mirror. What AI reveals about how we actually think and decide. We've talked about identity threat, emotional contagion, and the psychological burden on middle managers during change and transformation. Now we're going to examine what happens when AI enters the picture and begins reflecting back the biases, the assumptions, and the decision-making patterns that organizations and their leaders have been hiding from themselves. The research shows that 95% of corporate AI projects fail to create measurable value. And 91% of CIOs cite culture, not technology, as the primary barrier to AI adoption. When AI functions as a mirror, what it reveals about human systems can be deeply uncomfortable and critically important. That episode is one you're not going to want to miss. If you found today's episode valuable, explore these concepts further in my Transformation Psychology series on 2040digital.com. You can explore my weekly newsletter, Ideas and Innovations on Substack, or pick up a copy of my book, The Truth About Transformation. You can also subscribe to the Human Factor podcast wherever you watch or listen to podcasts. Please share this episode with your senior leadership team because the middle management trap is a problem only senior leadership has the structural power to solve. Until next time, remember, your transformation strategy is only as strong as the human beings you're asking to carry it. And the people carrying the heaviest load are the ones most organizations forget to support. Stop blaming the middle. Start supporting it. This is the Human Factor Podcast. I'm Kevin Novak. Thanks for watching or listening.